Right up until post-production, The Innocents was to begin with a funeral scene with the burial of Miles, the little boy, with Deborah Kerr going back to the house at Bly, which is covered in white sheets like ghosts, and she writes a letter to the uncle. But this seemed too literal, too much of a flashback, so they decided to start in a much more haunting way at the last minute. First of all with the song, O Willow Whaley, written by Paul Dane, ex-film critic who went on to write the scripts of Goldfinger and a lot of the Planet of the Apes movies. Whaley is a great English folk word meaning lament. This is a lament for someone about their dead lover sitting in the willows. And what's extraordinary is that normally 20th Century Fox films begin with the famous fanfare and the Fox logo, but instead we have this wispy, pseudo-Victorian song, and somehow they persuaded the Fox executives to start with that. But the most important thing was to start with the thought that maybe this whole story is going on in the head of the governess figure. How on earth do you do that? You certainly don't do that by having a funeral scene. Instead, you start with darkness, with bird song. That's strange for a start. You're not supposed to have birds at night. In fact, I asked the editor, Jim Clark, about this. He said, oh, well, they must have been nightingales. And then the credits with hands, which may be praying against a black background, and the voice of Deborah Kerr as the governess, with two found bits of dialogue that come later in the film. One of them is from the scene with the uncle, played by Michael Redgrave, and another is from a much later scene with Mrs. Gross, played by Megs Jenkins. Stills of the earlier sequence were actually issued as part of the publicity, so this was very late in the day. But what it creates is the thought that there's guilt, there's someone looking back. Are they raving? Are they praying? Are they supplicating? What's going on in Deborah Kerr's mind? It creates this subjective idea that maybe this entire story is a figment of her imagination. And it's a brilliant way of capturing the entire ambiguity of the tale. It's a cosmic story about the battle between good and evil. It's a Henry Jamesian story about innocence in peril. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. But at the same time, it's a projection of this rather sheltered vicar's daughter who's been brought up in a remote country vicarage, a very fundamentalist environment, as we discover, and is about to be launched into the huge country estate at Bly.
All I want to do is save the children, not destroy them. More than anything.
So the whole ambiguity of the tale, what level should it be taken at, is all in this opening. And it creates an extraordinary sense of doubt in the viewer. Horror movies are meant to be more straightforward than this.
Love. Someone who will belong to
The other thing about this sequence is that it ends with a long dissolve. Every single sequence in this film, apart from one, which we'll talk about, ends and begins with a dissolve, a kind of languid sense of pace. And in fact, what Jack Clayton said was, what he wanted was reference to the scene before, a floating image in between, and then reference to the scene that follows. It makes this film feel a lot longer than the 99 minutes that it runs.
I spend a great deal of time abroad,
and we begin with the scene in Harley Street, which in the original story by Henry James takes place before the story actually begins. It's part of the narration. In the story, she's 20 years old. Deborah Kerr was nearly 40. But as we'll see, in the intensity of her performance, it really doesn't seem to matter.
Two orphaned infants. It's most unfortunate, for I have no room.
The dissolve that introduces this scene shows the contrast between Deborah Kerr's face in the credits, half in darkness, half in light, to the young, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed Deborah Kerr of this sequence.
They are at my country estate in Bly.
Note the rose in the uncle's buttonhole. Note the masculine environment. As it says in the script, a moneyed masculinity has hung the walls with old maps and spoils of the chase.
More than anything, I love children.
Yes.
How remarkable. For several years now, little Miles and Flora, charming names, don't you think? have had only...
They had to cast someone who was very charismatic. This is the only scene that the uncle appears in. And at one point, Jack Clayton toyed with the idea of casting Cary Grant in this part. He bumped into him in the commissary at Shepperton Studios and said, "You wouldn't like to play the uncle, would you?" And Cary Grant sort of half agreed, but said, "I'll only play it if the uncle comes in at the end, so you get a sense of the uncle's performance pervading the entire movie." And as Jack Clayton said, he could possibly be the only director in 1960-61 who actually turned down Cary Grant.
The person whom I engage must...
And the uncle himself, it says in the script, in a quote directly from Henry James's novella, is cold and pleasant, offhand and gay and kind. Actually, he isn't quite so kind in this version. He's very callous when he talks about the children. He's very callous when he talks about the death of the previous governess.
What do you say, Miss Gibbons?
But he has to be magnetic. He has to be very, very charismatic. Variety, when reviewing this film, said, what a waste of Michael Redgrave. They only had him for a day or two, and he never appears again. The whole point is that his presence must be there in the background throughout the film. It must be a very charismatic performance.
Especially little Flora. Oh, which reminds me, be careful not to broach that subject.
Michael Redgrave had done just the same thing in the previous year with a film called Shake Hands with the Devil, where he plays the general, a sort of Michael Collins figure, the guy who runs the IRA. And he basically had one big scene and two short ones, but you feel Michael Redgrave's presence, despite James Cagney as the lead, throughout the movie. He was beginning to specialise in cameos of this kind.
I was in Calcutta when it happened.
The story, The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, begins on Christmas Eve. It's a ghost story for Christmas, with people telling each other stories. And a narrator writes of a man called Douglas, we don't know if it's his first name or his second name, who has a manuscript written 20 years before by the governess. So you get, in the opening of the story, all sorts of ambiguities about who can you trust, whose point of view is this being told from, is the narrator a trustworthy witness? And of course it turns out later on that she isn't. The credit sequence of The Innocents establishes that, and then the uncle sequence rather reinforces it, particularly this moment with the clasping of the hands. As it says in the script, he continues to hold her hand. Miss Giddens is highly conscious of this physical contact. She is flattered and excited. In a very Victorian way, Miss Giddens, as she's called in the film and in the play The Innocents by William Archibald, Miss Giddens has become completely infatuated by the uncle, and that kind of repressed desire will lead her in all sorts of directions. In Henry James's novella, she expects Bly House to be rather a tumbling Gothic mansion and the children to be little monsters. And she's very, very impressed by how bright and fairy tale-like Bly is. In fact, Freddie Francis painted some of the trees in order to make them even more bright than they really are. So you have to put over the fact she's relieved and excited in rather an ingenue way that she's coming to a fairy tale castle.
Oh, stop! Please stop!
Here she is entering the main gate of Sheffield Park, which was the location near Brighton, where they started filming in February 1961. First of all, location shooting in the grounds, not inside the house. The interior was a design by Wilfred Shingleton, the production designer. But they shot in the grounds and then went to Shepperton Studios when they'd got what they want. Jack Clayton had location scouts looking all over the place for Bly, and they couldn't find anywhere. And then he was reading a travel magazine one day and loved the idea of these lakes, of the different levels of the landscape, and, of course, the Gothic Revival house in the background. And what we have here is the strange incongruity of Deborah Kerr in this huge bustle skirt with its crinoline and its corseted top, this very sort of urban figure in a costume that could have come out of a Manet or a Tissot painting, wandering through the rhododendrons of Sheffield Park. Footnote, the rhododendrons were only introduced in 1910, so this is rather anachronistic, but does that matter? No, not really. What we need is the lake, a lush landscape, and a fairy tale setting for her to be absolutely bowled over by. She's never been in such space in her life from her cramped vicarage. The costume was designed by Motley, a theatrical and film design group. Margaret Harris, her sister Sophia Harris, or Sophia Devine, and Elizabeth Montgomery. And it was actually Sophia Harris who did most of the film work. And they specialised in highly detailed historical costumes.
Isn't your name Flora?
This is set in mid-Victorian England. The Henry James story is turn of the century. It describes a manuscript that was written 20 years before by a governess who was 20 when she took the job. So we're talking mid-Victorian. And this dress would also, for filmgoers, of course, have immediately reminded them of the 1956 film The King and I, where Deborah Kerr also played a governess, where she also wore a crinoline, where she sang the song Getting to Know You, Getting to Know All About You, which could almost be a subtitle of this scene as she talks to little Flora. Flora was played by Pamela Franklin, born 1949. She was in fact 11 when the film was made, never appeared in a film before, and was training to be a dancer. But after this, she moved into a film career. The names in Henry James's story are very, very symbolic. Flora, the girl, the flowers, Miles, her brother, the soldier, Miles, the unnamed governess, because as Henry James said, the less we know about the governess, the better. She's a kind of cipher for telling the story. We don't know what she wears, we don't know what her name is, we don't really know anything about her physical appearance. But of course, in a film, you have to fill in all those details.
Oh, do please come in. Thank you, you're very kind.
Another recent performance that Governess, I think, relates to is the film Separate Tables, where she plays Sybil, a very repressed young girl dominated by her mother. That repression is also very much part of this performance. One of the most demanding of Deborah Kerr's career, she is in fact on screen in every single sequence in the film, which is essential for the point of view.
I never imagined. Oh, I'm so sorry.
One of the ways in which the film was opened out, both from William Archibald's play and from the original novella, is in this sense of decaying nature. When she touches the roses, the petals fall off. Behind every beautiful thing in this film is a sense of sort of decay and decadence and decline, and that was very much the contribution of the writer Truman Capote. Beauty and cruelty, beauty and transience. He also added the animals, Rupert the tortoise, the pony, the pigeons, this sense of nature as well as supernature, and this idea of a very elaborate sound design where both silences and the cawing of rooks and the chirping of sparrows and the sound of the pigeons is used almost expressionistically as part of the atmosphere. All these things were added in order to give the film more variety and tension and pace.
Sit down, miss, and have your tea.
Jack Clayton wasn't awfully happy with William Archibald's play, or indeed the first draft screenplay that emerged from it, precisely because it lacked that variety. It obeyed the unities, it was largely in the drawing room, it was a performance between four characters, and it absolutely had to be opened out in order, as Clayton said, to keep the audience on their toes. You're very dependent on the four central performances, Miss Giddens, Mrs. Gross, and the two children. The whole thing stands or falls with them. So you've got to bring in all sorts of variety and technical effects and the dissolves and cinema in order to ring the changes.
Well, he'll be coming home soon.
Not, I should think, until the holidays.
Another aspect of this Garden of Eden that she's come into, and remember that the first line the little girl says is all about reptiles. Another aspect of this is that Jack Clayton commissioned a series of concept drawings from the artist John Piper to set the visual scene. And John Piper had, in fact, done drawings for Benjamin Britten's opera, The Turn of the Screw, a production that was put on by the BBC in 1959. It has a series of orchestral interludes, and these were illustrated by John Piper, and this may have given Jack Clayton the idea. What it hooks into is to very much an art movement of the 1950s called neo-romanticism. Eden and Arcadia is under threat. They've come out of the Second World War. The British landscape is no longer innocent. The worm is in the bud, and they're all inhabitants of T.S. Eliot's wasteland. And this is very much a visual key to the film, which Truman Capote managed to transpose into script terms. And that was another way in which the novella and the play could be pumped up into a film.
Mrs. Gross,
Yes, miss?
Mrs. Gross is played by Megs Jenkins, who first entered the film industry in 1939, appeared in the wonderful wartime film Millions Like Us, and after the war, the Ealing film Painted Boats. And she really came to specialise in plump, down-to-earth, salt-of-the-earth sort of characters. I think this was probably her career best. In Henry James's story, he refers to Mrs. Gross, and of course the name again, Gross, to the blessings of a want of imagination, which is rather a cruel thing to say. In the film, I think it's more subtle. She starts off rather believing in Miss Giddens and what she's saying, but slowly begins to have her doubts, at which point Miss Giddens has to exercise her authority over Mrs. Gross, because after all, Miss Giddens is in charge of the entire staff of Bly. And that subtlety in the relationship was essential as it was turned into a drama. The cut to the bathroom scene is the only shot cut in the entire film. Every other sequence is linked by dissolves.
I've got a little bed in your room. It's got curtains.
How nice.
Yes.
In the shooting script, and only cut while they were filming, there's a little bit extra in the bathroom scene, which is an example of Truman Capote's rather puckish sense of humour. There's small, wet footsteps on the floor, and Flora says, "Somebody's been here." And Deborah Kerr says, "You silly goose, it was you." And then the footsteps dry and disappear, and as they disappear, Flora says, "But I'm not vanishing. Now you can't tell where I've walked." And it's a kind of gag. It's like some of the double entendres in the film. Mrs. Gross, I like a child with spirit. And those Truman Capote-type double entendres run right through the film. The production design of the interior of Bly was by Wilfred Shingleton. He designs in this neo-Gothic vicarage, Pugin Gothic style with mullioned windows and a skylight and heavy Victoriana everywhere and the drapes over the bed. It's a very effective piece of production design built at Shepperton Studios. And the key thing was to get, again, the visual variety of the house. In the play by William Archibald, it's all in the drawing room. So we now have the bedroom, we have the attic, we have the corridors, we have the walks up the stairs. You get a sense of the geography of the house. Wilfred Shingleton had been involved in building the sets for David Lean's Great Expectations, to which there's a reference later on in this film, and he'd worked for John Huston on The African Queen and Beat the Devil. And on Beat the Devil, Jack Clayton was associate producer, Freddie Francis, the cinematographer, was involved, and Truman Capote had written the script. Beat the Devil was one of the crucibles from which The Innocents emerged a few years later.
Sometimes one can't help imagining things.
Deborah Kerr's beginning to think that this huge, creepy house and the angelic Flora are perhaps, there's more to them than meets the eye. The doubt is beginning to emerge, and she's beginning to suffer from insomnia, which is very much stressed in Henry James's story, that for the first few nights in Bly, she just can't sleep. Strange sounds in the garden, strange creaks, and here, Flora standing at the foot of her bed, rather like the incubus in Fuseli's painting, The Nightmare. Maybe she isn't quite so innocent after all. Freddie Francis, the cinematographer, had a real problem when shooting the interiors in this film, because movies made by 20th Century Fox were in CinemaScope. They had been for the last 6 years. It was a patented technology by Fox. And in fact, Freddie Francis had used CinemaScope in Sons and Lovers the year before, for which he'd won an Oscar. But this is a very intimate drama, a four-hander between these four people, and it's very important we're encouraged to focus on those people rather than on the noise that's going on around them. And he got round this in two ways. One, by putting an awful lot of light into the middle of the image so that he could take the camera down a stop or two in order to have deep focus. So you've got two people in focus at the same time with a lot of light. And this caused a lot of ribaldry on the set. In fact, there's a slightly iffy production still that was issued where Freddie Francis is actually giving Deborah Kerr a black doll, because there were so many jokes about how bright the sunshine was, how bright the light was, they'd all get too much of a suntan. And on one occasion, Deborah Kerr turned up in sunglasses. So one way in which she got intensity and focus on these central performances was through ramming a lot of brute lights into the middle, which you had to do in those days. But the second way was by doing things with the edge of the frame. You know, horror movies come in two styles visually, one of them in your face and the other at the corner of the retina, and this is a corner of the retina movie. What happens at the corner of the image? Well, sometimes you have uprights, you have pillars, bits of bed, sculptures, all sorts of verticals on either side of the cinemascope image, and that's one way of doing it, so you're actually framing the central action. Another way is by having a tunnel of light, a circle of light in the middle of the image, a kind of light that's thrown by candles. We'll see a little bit later on when Deborah Kerr explores the house in more detail. And that again brings the viewer to look at the centre of the image rather than the sides. It's a classic use of cinemascope. You wouldn't imagine a ghost story could be filmed in cinemascope, in letterbox, but this was an occasion when it could be. Music by Georges Auric, who'd written the music for La Belle et la Bête and The Wages of Fear. And whenever there's a rather sinister moment, you get these little plinkety-plonks on the soundtrack just to alert you. It is said that Jack Clayton wasn't too happy with Georges Auric's score and got Lambert Williamson to reorchestrate it. And in fact, Williamson gets a credit at the beginning of the film. Whether or not that's true, the music is very, very understated. Again, for people who are used to the sort of James Bernard score of a Hammer film. Boo, bom. You don't have any of that. It's very, very subtle. But you do get these little clues when something odd is about to happen, like the fact that Flora seems to telepathically realise that Miles is about to be sent home from school. How does she know that? What's this strange communication between the two children?
What has he done? What do the gentlemen say?
Oh, they go into no detail. They simply say, here, read it. Read it for yourself.
And this is where Deborah Kerr begins to use the language of the vicarage in order to describe what's going on. She's very keen on bringing in words like corruption and obscenity and horrors. She rather rushes to judgment in a dogmatic way, again picked up from Henry James's story. From the slightest of evidence, a boy's been expelled from school. There could be all sorts of reasons for that. And part of Truman Capote's script is basically saying that Victorian values are the bad guys, that Deborah Kerr's repression, her sexual repression, her sense of desire for the uncle, her upbringing, encourages her to project onto the events that are happening around her this kind of fundamentalist vision. And that's a very late 50s, early 60s theme. Let's challenge Victorian values. Jack Clayton said that he made The Innocents because he didn't want to be typecast as a maker of new wave, new realism films. He'd just made Room at the Top, which had been a huge success. But actually, this movie bears the stamp of the late 50s, early 60s, much more than one would imagine. The two children, a delinquent couple, dysfunctional family, absent parents, attack on Victorian values. All of that is very much the kind of world that the new wave cinema also represented.
I hope Miles will agree.
And here at the station, Sheffield Park Station, built by a Victorian Lord Sheffield to take wood from the estate to the coast, Miles arrives. He's dressed as a little gentleman, he has a bouquet of flowers, and it's very important, says Jack Clayton in his notes on his personal copy of the script, the introduction of Miles is very important. He must look beautiful and angelic and behave with dignity without being priggish, but he must also be a little gentleman, an avatar for the uncle. And so in a funny way, he arrives at the station and a courtship starts. As Jack Clayton says in his notes, that Miss Giddens' enchantment with Miles must begin here. She must fall under his spell. He's a grown-up, but he's also a child. He's capable of being very, very childish, but he's also capable of behaving like the uncle. And at this stage, that's the role model. Later on, there'll be a more sinister role model.
Too pretty to be a governess.
And I think you're far too young to be such a deceitful flatterer.
Notice how Flora throws the bouquet of flowers out of the coach, a tiny touch that isn't even in the script. Much is made of the bouquet being given to Miss Giddens, and she's dressed up specially, just like she does for the uncle, to meet Miles at the station. She's given this bouquet, and Flora casually chucks it out of the coach window. The role of flower imagery in this film is extremely complex. We've seen the decaying roses, we've seen Flora, the child of the flowers in the garden, bouquets, the sense of nature corrupting from the inside. All of that, which has a Southern Gothic flavour to it, was clearly brought to the project by Truman Capote, who, as Jack Clayton said, was really responsible for 90% of the ideas in this script.
To run in the family.
And that cruel letter.
It must be a misunderstanding, a mistake.
Yes, a mistake. So, what will you say to Master Miles?
I shall have it out with him later on. That can't be avoided, but not now. I'm not going to spoil his homecoming just because of some silly old
In the script, when they both decide not to make anything of Miles' expulsion from the school, it says, and together the two women walk into the house. In the film, they embrace in this way, but there's a closeness between them. Mrs. Gross approves of Miss Giddens and what she represents. They believe each other. They're bonded as a kind of sisterhood. Throughout the film, Miss Giddens, right from the credit sequence, keeps saying, I want the children to belong to me and I want to belong to them. There's this reaching out. She wants affection. And, of course, one of the themes of the film is how belonging can turn into possession.
How did you know I was there?
This is a very old house. Things creak. And anyway, I saw the light from your candle under the door.
You should be asleep.
I'm much too excited.
Excited?
By being home, by seeing Flora. And meeting you.
The catapult in Miles's bedroom will be referred to later on when we're introduced to a dead pigeon. Is this sinister? Is he a cruel child who enjoys killing nature in the way that children are sometimes cruel? Or is this something a lot deeper?
Oh, no, all that seems very far away.
Miles, you do know that you will not be allowed to go back.
Miss Giddens in this sequence, according to the script, is trying to bring up the issue of why he was expelled from school, trying to be charming and rather torn. She doesn't want to make it obvious, so she wants to be affectionate, but at the same time she wants to find out something from him. And that's the detective story element of this film. Jack Clayton said that the starting point for the script of The Innocents was a kind of detective story, the revelation of different bits of information about what's going on in the house, what's going on with the children, what happened before Miss Giddens arrived. That all of that should be revealed bit by bit, and it's very important it is revealed bit by bit as the film progresses.
Not enough time.
To waste any on us. I understand. It's a bit sad, though, when people don't have time for you.
Jack Clayton was brought up in Brighton. He never went to school except for one term, and he never knew who his father was. One of the great secrets in the household that he was brought up in was that no one would say who his father was. And a lot of people have said he must have identified with Miles and with this dialogue about the absent guardian who shows no interest in him, the fact that mother and father aren't around, the fact the only relationship he has with his governess, the fact he's just been kicked out of school by a schoolmaster who doesn't understand him. That vulnerability and the secret world is something that Clayton identified with.
The candle's gone out.
Don't be frightened. It was only the wind, my dear.
And here's an example of the script actually, in my view, improving on Henry James. It was I who blew it out, dear, says little Miles in the story. But in the film, it was only the wind, my dear. One of the great lines. Should have been written by Henry James, even though it wasn't. And then a classic dissolve. The curtains to a rose, to the rose bush, with this rather overripe garden. And here, in the script, a stone cupid, its head tilted back, its infantile, toothless mouth widely smiling at her. In each of its outstretched hands, it clasps another hand, but these other hands are broken at the wrists. Like a small black tongue, a beetle appears, and that's the start of this strange sense of silence. The chirping, the buzzing of bees, Flora singing in the background, all goes to complete silence. And then she looks up at the battlements, and you get a sort of whiteout from the sun and this electronic sound. And she can't quite see. It could be anybody up there. You can't see the face. She drops her scissors into the bird bath. The whole thing in this film is that With one exception, every time you see the ghosts, you see Deborah Kerr's reaction first, which plants this sense of doubt. Is it all happening in her mind? Or are there actually ghosts struggling for the possession of these children? It's a brilliant way of putting over the ambiguity of the turn of the screw in purely visual terms. And now, slow-motion pigeons going across. And there's a little bit of a controversy about that technical effect. Freddie Francis said, in my presence actually, to some students at the Royal College of Art, rather waggishly, that it was all a mistake. It was the end of a magazine, a film, and the film rushed through, and when they printed it, the pigeons had slowed down. So it was a happy accident that they decided to keep. But the editor, Jim Clark, has said, no, that's not true. In fact, he said, absolute nonsense. We send it off to the optical people in order to stretch it, to get this sense of otherworldliness and the flutter of the wings as the pigeons fly across. Anyway, whatever the truth, it is a remarkable moment. And in fact, it started a lifelong fascination of director Jack Clayton with pigeons. He became a pigeon fancier, a pigeon racer from now on, one of the champions of Marlow, where he lived. And this is a scene that was added by the filmmakers, isn't in Henry James's story and isn't in the play, which is Miles on the top of the tower. Originally, they were going to have the vision of this figure at the top of the tower before Miles comes back from school. But they decided very sensibly to make it follow the scene in the bedroom, so there's an association between Miles and the figure.
Well, that can't be true. Not 2 minutes ago, I saw a man standing exactly here.
Martin Stevens, the actor, also born in 1949, like Pamela Franklin, was actually something of a veteran of movies already. He'd appeared in the Hellfire Club, he'd appeared in The Village of the Damned, and astonishingly had appeared in a film called Count Your Blessings as Deborah Kerr's son.
Oh, yes, I expect I'm tired.
When the scene at the top of the tower was filmed, it says in Jack Clayton's script, in his own writing, film Quint the actor with and without flair. And the point of that is that there's one shot of him where you can't actually see who he is. And that's the shot we've seen. But later on, when Deborah Kerr starts hallucinating and can't sleep and has this vision of Quint at the top of the tower, importantly, this time she can see his face. What's happened in between is that she realises what Quint looks like. It is difficult, says the script, to tell the shadow from the substance.
Miss, would these by any chance be yours? Scissors. The gardener brought them up. He said he found them in the garden.
Oh, yes, I must have dropped them this morning whilst I was cutting the roses.
And just left them there.
I'm afraid today isn't altogether my day. I seem to be at 6s and 7s.
Well, miss, you've never been away from home before. A strange place, new responsibilities. Takes a bit of getting used to.
Mrs. Gross, is there anyone living here that I don't know about?
Living here?
In the house, I mean. I've met the 2 maids and the cook and her husband, the gardener, and I was just wondering if there was someone I hadn't met.
Bless you, miss.
One of the key texts, which commentaries on the turn of the screw, which lay behind this film, was Edmund Wilson's 1934 essay, The Ambiguity of Henry James, the great Freudian reading about how the whole thing is a hallucination on the part of the governess. In fact, a typescript version of it was included in Jack Clayton's production notes. Another was a famous essay by Virginia Woolf, written in 1921. Perhaps it is the silence that first impresses us. Everything at Bly is so profoundly quiet. It makes us strangely apprehensive of noise, and certainly the filmmakers picked up on this. But this is a very violent, noisy scene. It says, as Jack Clayton wrote to himself, violent action, all this scene, purely visual. Dialogue can only be shouted, which blends with pictures. And she looks up at the trees. It sounds like clapping, it says. It merges into the cawing of rooks. But you don't see any birds. You hear them flutter. It sounds like them applauding this performance on the pony. But you don't see any of the birds. So, again, a disjunction between what Deborah Kerr thinks she sees and what we, the viewer, sees. And at this point, there was a moment in the script that was cut. Flora says, "Oh dear, I think it's going to rain. The pretty lady will get wet." And then takes Miss Giddens's hand, and then Miles takes her hand. We rather hope she does, don't we, Miss Giddens? So the pretty lady could be Miss Giddens, it could be Flora, or maybe it's a reference to a pretty lady who isn't with them at all.
Goodness, no. It's a thunderstorm. See the clouds?
This schoolroom scene, which begins with a drawing of a pony, actually, in the original version of the opening of the film, the drawing of the pony was something that Deborah Kerr picks up when she goes back into Bly, just before she writes her letter to the uncle, so that would have had a double charge. But this sequence is not so much taken from William Archibald's play, or indeed from The Turn of the Screw, but I think it comes from Benjamin Britten's opera, which, according to Freddie Francis, Jack Clayton was fascinated by, where there's big emphasis on the schoolroom scene and the learning of their Latin grammar, where Miles sings this very poignant song.
So large.
Marlowe, I would rather be Marlowe in an apple tree, Marlowe from a naughty boy, Marlowe in adversity. And this song keeps recurring until at the very end, the governess, cradling Miles in her arms, sings the Marlowe song. It's the equivalent of Willow Whaley in this film.
Too small for you to have secrets.
Well, secrets were a bit difficult.
But possible.
Not for long. Secrets require a privacy that our little home did not provide.
Did you play games in your house?
No, we had to be quiet usually because my father was preparing his sermon. But if he went out, we'd play hide and seek all over the house.
Oh, lovely. Let's do that.
All right. You hide and I'll seek.
We can go all over the house, can't we? Everywhere, I mean.
Yes, I should think so.
Oh, where are the children?
And now the game of hide and seek, and in a way that could be a summary of Miss Giddens's relationship with the children during this central portion of the film, in awe at the beginning, treating them as little angels, and suddenly trying to sort of quiz them and find out more about them. The game, in fact, comes not from Henry James's story, but from William Archibald's play. And in fact, some of the key sequences in the film, hide and seek, charades, the song that introduces it, although it was called Bring Me a Bonnet, all those things came from the play.
Anna?
First sighting of someone walking inside the house, a lady in black. Is it one of the servants? The servants seem remarkably absent in this film. In the story, there's lots of servants. There's a gardener, chambermaid, cook, Mrs. Gross. But this has been distilled down to a four-parter. And with a vertigo moment, as we go up this expressionist staircase, we end up in the attic. The attic, another piece of the geography of the house that was added for the film, with lots of Victorian bric-a-brac in the background. A doll with a nodding head, heightened soundtrack noise again, a harp, bits of decay, and an important musical box which plays the Willow Whaley song, a traditional English folk tune with new words by Paul Dane. Interestingly, and this has led to certain confusions, Benjamin Britten was later to do an arrangement of this very folk tune, but he had nothing to do with the film. And now the key vignette, the photograph of Quint in the broken glass. And in comes Miles, an extraordinary, the first time that the relationship seems to be reversed, where Deborah Kerr becomes the supplicant and Miles becomes the man of the house. This extraordinary piece of physical action where she begins to be hurt by Miles.
Yes, Miles. Please let me go.
Why?
I told you, you're hurting me. Now, Miles, I mean it.
You're hurting me is a phrase that comes later on when she wanders around the house, where it takes on a much more sinister connotation.
Hurry, run!
All right.
Victoriana was very in vogue in the late 50s. Antique shops specialising in Victoriana, John Betjeman writing about Victoriana. It was being reappraised in the late 50s, having been mocked in the early 50s as ugly and over-ornate. And so the bric-a-brac in the attic is part of the craze for Victoriana. The tapestry, a hunting tapestry, the lady assailed by demons and griffins with deer in the background. More roses with the petals falling off. There are so many roses in this film. Almost every dissolve seems to have roses in it, and billowing curtains. The rose, the curtains, well, both of those come from La Belle et la Bête. How do you show the ghosts? This was a great conundrum. The whole thing about cinema is it's very literal about these things. The audience has seen something, so how do you actually suggest that the image is ambiguous? Well, they had a great difficulty in this first appearance of Quint, played by Peter Wingard, the British theatre, television and film actor. They had a zoom, they had a shock cut, they had the camera moving from the statue in the garden to Quint. They couldn't quite make up their mind how to do it. But in the end, they solved it by having Quint on a trolley with wheels, according to Jim Clark, the editor. So he was pushed in, so he kind of glides into the frame and disappears in this rather unworldly way. Jack Clayton wasn't happy with the way Quint was presented in this film. He found it too Hammer films, too obvious, too melodramatic. Whereas the appearances of Miss Jessel as a ghost he felt were much more effective. But Quint has to be a strong, insolent character, as it says in the script, looking at her and through her with a peculiar insolence. And his face has to be mingled with the reflected image of Miss Giddens. That all of that, this malevolence has to come through. So I think it works well. I think Jack Clayton was too hard on himself.
There's a picture of him. A miniature in a...
Jim Clark also remembers that the cut was partly based on that great moment in David Lean's Great Expectations, where little Pip first catches sight of Magwitch, the convict, played by Finlay Curry, and the little boy looks up, boom, you get the face of Magwitch. And that they very much had in mind with the face of Quint at the window. So far, apart from the lady in black wandering in the corridor, the ghosts have been quite a long way away, but they're trying to get in. The house is under siege from these spirits, this sense that they are at a distance, but they want to get closer. And that's part of the claustrophobia at this stage in the film. Jack Clayton was worried in the script. He kept writing, be careful of having too much dialogue at this stage. We mustn't slow things down. We must prune the script as we go along. In fact, Truman Capote came from Switzerland to be on the set to strip the dialogue down. One of the problems with Edmund Wilson's thesis about The Turn of the Screw is, as everyone said, how did Miss Giddens know what Quint looked like? And in the film, they add this photograph from the attic, which makes clear that the image of Quint's face is planted in her mind. And the film is full of clues like that. If you want to believe the reductive interpretation, which is the whole thing is a kind of fantasy of a repressed spinster from a country vicarage, then you can. On the other hand, if you want to believe that the ghosts are out there, you can. Or if you want to believe somewhere in the middle, that in a way she's come to the house, she is the kind of medium through which the ghosts manifest themselves. She's drawing the evil to the house. Then you can believe that as well.
Your pencil does have the most terrible squeak, Flora.
It does, doesn't it?
And all these clues are put in, which made the critics feel a little bit let down. The Hammer film buffs, and remember Hammer had burst on the scene in 1957 and was really getting the headlines at the moment, felt there wasn't enough gore and there were too many explanations. It was too cold. It was a piece of technical ingenuity, this film. Whereas the Henry James buffs, and, you know, one of the things this film had to carry was the burden of an acknowledged classic. There's nothing worse than a movie bearing the burden of an acknowledged classic. How do you shake off all those levels of interpretation and the joy that The Turn of the Screw had brought to countless generations of readers? They felt that it was too spooky and too Hammer films, and that some of the effects were too obvious. The clock ticking, the candles, the wandering around the corridors, the ghosts as they appeared. You couldn't win, but I think Jack Clayton was trying to steer a middle course between two aesthetics. The corner of the retina, the suggestion, the shadows, the things you can't quite see on the one hand, and the shock of the actual ghost story on the other. And I think, I don't think this film is too academic, and I don't think it's too schlocky. I think it steers a remarkable course between those two aesthetics.
Hurry!
Now, on his personal copy of the script, Jack Clayton wrote, "Look at this dialogue. Can be better." He was worried because this next sequence has a lot of exposition in it. It's all about Quint and how Quint died and the relationship between Quint and the boy Miles. There's a lot to put over, some of which comes from the play. And it's fine in a play, but in a movie, you've got to keep things going. So he was worried that it might not be visually interesting enough. It's more detective story, more jigsaw, and another stage in the development of Miss Giddens' relationship to this ghost story.
Oh, as for the other night, miss, put it out of your mind. Pretend it was part of a dream, which perhaps it was.
A dream? Oh, don't you think I want to believe that? That it was just the darkness, a nightmare? But it's no longer dark, it's daylight, and I know I saw him.
When it first came out, Henry James's story, The Turn of the Screw, was treated just as a ghost story, and rather an indecent one at that, because it involved children. Only subsequently, from the 1920s onwards, did critics start looking at it from the point of view of Freudian interpretation. And then latterly, people have interpreted it as about the point of view of the author. Can you trust the narrator? So it's gone through all these incarnations, and in a way, all of those are in the film as well.
How did he die?
Quint? Out there, miss, on those very steps. It was winter. The coldest, blackest winter's night. The steps were icy. And Quint, he came home late after we were all abed. Late and full of drink. There was a wound on his head as if he'd slipped. As if he'd fallen out there.
Here's a wonderful deep focus shot, which could have come straight out of Citizen Kane, Greg Toland's photography. But lots and lots of light on the two faces, with not much light outside them. So many lights, said Freddie Francis, that he was accused of trying to burn down Shepperton Studios.
It was an accident.
He was a peculiar man. There were things in his life that could account for violence done him. Vicious things.
And here we learn a lot more about Quint, the valet who wears his master's clothing, and Quint's relationship with Miles. We learn that Quint is a countryman, reference to hunting. There's a subtle class thing, actually, in Mrs. Gross's attitude to Quint. He wasn't quite upper crust and therefore shouldn't have spent so much time with the boy. In fact, there's a piece of script earlier on in Flora's first meeting with Miss Giddens where Flora says, I'd love to do housework with Mrs. Gross, but she won't let me. I'm a lady. I can go on picnics and I can play in the garden, but I'm not allowed to do housework. And it's a subtle class Victorian thing that comes through, particularly through Mrs. Gross, which was rather lost in the final film.
It's about to commence.
Oh, look, miss.
And now the charades game, taken directly from William Archibald's play. In the play, Flora has a song, and then Miles has a song, which he sings, and everyone thought that it must be some Victorian poem, you know, what shall I sing to my lord from my window? What shall I sing, for my lord will not stay? Who's my lord? Is he summoning Quint? Enter, my lord, come from your prison, come from your grave, for the moon is arisen. And he throws open the French windows in the play, and you get a sense of it. He's the apport, as spiritualists call it, that's summoning the ghost.
My lord will not listen. Where shall I go? For my lord is away. Whom shall I love when
Well, in the film, he speaks it rather than singing it, maybe because Martin Stevens couldn't sing. There's various looks that pass between Miss Giddens and Ma. She's thinking, this is very grown up. What's he saying? This is a grown-up Victorian poem in the mouth of a 10-year-old boy. It's creepy. And she's starting to put two and two together. And it's much, much more subtle. The looks between them, as she sits there with the mock medieval tapestry behind her, very Victorian, very Pugin, puts her very much, locates her in mid-Victorian times. And he goes up to the French window. You see his reflection just as we saw her reflection when she saw Quint behind the curtains. And then he turns round and looks. And that's what we get, that look.
Look at that. What, miss?
And it plants this seed of doubt in her mind. Does he know about Quint? Does he know that he's about to be possessed? And does Flora know the same? And is this innocence and the angelic quality of the children a mask? And her whole attitude to the children changes. It's a pivotal moment in the story where instead of her treating them as little angels or as wayward little angels, she now thinks that they are in complicity with the spirits. And so her job changes. It's now a question of exorcism, of getting them to confront what it is that's happening to them. And she has to take a much more a crusading role in their lives instead of just being their governess. And she also has to justify herself much more because she's going to do things that Mrs. Gross will find rather repellent and very difficult to stomach. And so there's a kind of manic self-justification that comes into the governess's role, which Deborah Kerr handles very well.
Dance together. Dance by the hour. But she changed.
Miss Jessel and Flora used to dance together. This plants another seed. In one of the dream sequences coming up, we'll see Flora dancing with Miss Jessel. We'll see Flora dancing in the folly by the lake, apparently dancing for Miss Jessel. That's planted a seed in Deborah Kerr's mind that she will develop as the film goes on. Remember that Pamela Franklin was training to be a dancer, and this must have been one of the attractions of casting her in the role of Flora.
Yes, but is it?
Lots of reflections, of course, lots of mirrors, lots of lakes, lots of windows. The idea of reflection, which was written into the script by Truman Capote. And a classic dissolve here. White smoke dissolved to white, which is unusual. The sculptures, the statuary, the classical sculptures, to the willows surrounding this Gothic folly in the garden. Jim Clark said how difficult they were to do, but it was a very important part of this to get the tempo of the film, to link the sequences. John Mortimer, when he was involved in constructing the script for 3 weeks, said he got some advice from Jack Clayton. Always think in the construction about the scene before, the sort of hyphen between scenes, and the scene to come. We want lots of that to create a kind of otherworldly, strange tempo atmosphere, as if life at Bly is moving at a different pace to life everywhere else.
No, dear, what?
He said that once, when he was on the lake, he could see a hand waving on the bottom. But Mrs. Gross said, stuff and nonsense.
Was the folly specially built for the film? Well, there's a bit of a mystery there. There was a summer house at Sheffield Park. On the other hand, John Piper's concept drawings have a picture of the folly, and it is identical to this one. And I think this is a Wilfred Shingleton set. It's too good to be true, this wonderful neo-Gothic folly, open to the sides. In fact, as it says in the script, a little circular building similar to a temple in design, with arched roof supported by slim white columns, open to the air. It's too good that they would have found that, I think.
It's the song from the music box, isn't it? Isn't it?
And here we have Willow Whaley, the song. We've had Miles summoning Quint through his Victorian poem, and we've now got Flora summoning Miss Jessel through her Victorian song. And in the reeds opposite, and I think this is the spookiest moment in the whole film, there she is sitting there. It's a matte shot, because actually the folly was built in a different part of the lake to where Miss Jessel appears. How did they get her to stand in the reeds, in the water? Well, the actress was standing in a boat in the reeds. In the story by Henry James, what they see is a woman in black, pale and dreadful. And I think Jack Clayton got that absolutely to a T. She was played by Clayton Jessup, who was an Australian stage actress whose first film this was. And there's a bit of a mystery about it because it's a very powerful performance. Her physical presence is extraordinary. And yet she seems to have disappeared. I found another movie that she appears in, directed by Freddie Francis. It's called The Torture Garden, a portmanteau horror movie of 4 or 5 years later, which is Burgess Meredith as a fairground barker, where this gypsy woman sits next to him with shears, the shears of destiny, that cut the thread of various people's lives. Well, who plays the gypsy? It's Clayton Jessup. So obviously Freddie Francis is very impressed. She doesn't say anything, she just sits there, white makeup, looking like the pale lady again.
In the broad sunlight, I saw the other one.
The other one.
A woman dressed in black. Miss Jessel.
But Miss Jessel's dead. She died, why, almost a year ago.
Almost a year ago. Almost a year. Flora saw her, too.
Did she tell you so?
No, of course not. She lied to me.
In the story by William Archibald, one of the things that Flora learns is a poem by Tennyson called Mariana.
Why?
In sleep she seemed to walk forlorn till cold winds woke the grey-eyed morn about the lonely moated grange. She said, I am a weary, I would that I were dead. And Mrs. Gross, who is appalled by the child learning this poem, what was she thinking of to have you learn that? Tennyson, Fading Roses, very Victorian idea of the lady in black who's waiting for her lost lover across the pond is a fantastic piece of Victorian cloying sentimentality which fits so well with the ghost story. And they cut that out when adapting the play for the screenplay.
I felt so alone, but together with you to help me.
Oh, yes, miss, I'll help you. Only tell me how.
Yes.
We must try...
Jack Clayton once said that when he first read the story, aged 10, obviously it just scared the pants off him as a ghost story and maybe resonated with his own family background. But subsequently, when he read it, before reading the Freudian interpretations, he got this sense of the governess as a very passionate woman who, in her own way, is being honest, not with herself, but with everybody else. She thinks she's on a crusade. She's inexperienced. She's rather repressed. She's full of desire that she doesn't quite understand. She's fascinated by it. And in a way, the ghosts represent sex to her, sexual desire, another world, rather in the movie world, like the mirror in the Ealing portmanteau film Dead of Night of 1945, where the mirror represents desire and excitement and the other world that the repressed middle-class people looking into it can't quite understand. It's that other world of sex. And all of that had to come through in scenes like this.
Hurts me to remember. Bad she was, but no woman could have suffered more.
Lots of exposition, in this case about Quint and the relationship with Miss Jessel, which fascinates and appalls and repels the governess all at the same time.
I'm ashamed to say.
Go on.
Rooms used by daylight, as though they were dark woods.
There's three great bits of neo-Jamesian dialogue in the film. One we've had, "It's only the wind, my dear." We've had Mrs. Gross saying he had the devil's own eye about Quint, which is a great improvement, actually, on Henry James. And here we have rooms used by daylight as though they were dark woods, which is the one line that John Mortimer, apart from his construction of the script, remembers actually writing in the style of Henry James. As though they were dark woods. Now, that plants a seed in Deborah Kerr's mind that will come through in some of her fantasies later on.
Quint, Miles, I can hear them together.
But there was nothing wrong in Master Miles wanting to be with Quint. Quint taught him to ride and took him walking. The poor lad needed someone
To corrupt him?
But Master Miles is a good boy, miss. There's nothing wicked in him.
Unless he's deceiving us, unless they're both deceiving us, the innocence.
One of the things Jack Clayton really wanted to take from William Archibald's play was the innocence as an idea. The idea that all four of the central characters in their own ways are innocent. Miss Giddens is innocent. She lacks life experience. She thinks she's doing the right thing. Actually, she's doing a lot of damage. Mrs. Gross is innocent. She really doesn't know what on earth's going on around her. But to start with, she's prepared to go with the governess before she gets disillusioned. The children are innocent, or are they? A lot of the things that they do, the catapult with Miles, the dancing with Flora, are childish things to do, but by now we're interpreting them as grown-up things to do.
That was pitiful.
What Jack Clayton found interesting was that, in the story, the governess reads a lot of Gothic novels. She reads Jane Eyre, she reads Mrs. Radcliffe, Mysteries of Udolpho, she reads Henry Fielding, and this has put all these romantic notions in her head, and she lacks the life experience to really understand what's real and what isn't, and that colours very much her reaction to the kind of material that Mrs. Gross is talking about.
Finally, she died.
The other thing that Mrs. Gross plants is that Miss Jessel went into mourning after the death of Quint and dressed in black, which is something that Deborah Kerr herself will do from this scene onwards. Now, it has to be said that Motley designed these 5 amazing outfits for her. Her arrival at the house outfit, her interview outfit for the uncle, her picnic outfit, and this very feminine blouse with velvet trimmings and the ribbon at the top.
I mean, if you were thinking of discussing with the vicar what...
These are fashion plate garments that are rather far-fetched for a young vicar's daughter coming away from home for the first time. But, you've got to dress the star, you've got the king and I to bear in mind, and both the hairdressing and the costume have to give real charisma to the central character. So in a way you can forgive that. But from now on, she dresses in a much more drab way in black, just as Miss Jessel did when she was in mourning for Quint.
But what good would it do, Miss?
Here's one of the great dissolve and superimposition scenes which Jim Clark had to put together. Quint's face on the vignette, the billowing curtains, Flora's face with whispering, multiple superimpositions. The tortoise, poor old Rupert the tortoise, who has a very, very rough time in this film. He's half drowned, he's abused, and eventually he's chucked through a plate glass window. So he has a rather bad movie, Rupert, invented by Truman Capote. Whispering, the relationship between Miles and Quint and Miss Jessel and Flora. What are they whispering about? Why are they giggling? Are they talking about grown-up things? She feels excluded. Now, here's the second shot of Quint on the battlements. You can now see who he is. Last time we couldn't. And Quint's hand touching Miles's hand in a moment of flashback in the relationship between the two of them. And remember, Miss Giddens has been told that Miss Jessel loved to dance with Flora. So that's part of the fantasy too. And there they are dancing. Flora and Miss Jessel. Very spooky movements in the darkness with the insomniac Miss Giddens, who is actually awake when she's thinking about this with her eyes open. It isn't just a dream, it's trying to piece all this information together. And of course, prayer. She prays at the beginning. It's become an exorcism issue. So there'll be more and more reference to religion.
I've made up my mind. Right after church, I shall take the next train to London and see their uncle. He must have returned.
But why, Miss?
In the dialogue sequence just gone by, they've made reference to the vicar, and there was a chunk of script that was actually cut quite late in the day, where Miss Giddens actually goes to see the vicar, and in a silent sequence, you see them talking together as Miss Giddens explains what she thinks is going on. But that was cut very wisely, I think, because it breaks the hermetic community of Bly and brings in the outside world.
Things that I haven't told you, that I can't bring myself to tell even you. Look at them. What do you think they're saying?
Well, I don't know, Miss. Just children's talk.
They're talking about them. Talking horrors. So far, these monsters have kept their distance. Only been seen in high places, through windows, across the lake. But they intend coming closer. And if they do...
What will you say to them, Master?
Well, what can I say?
They're on their way to church, but Deborah Kerr is pouring out her darkest thoughts about the children. Are they calculating liars? Are they little grown-ups being possessed by Quint and Miss Jessel? And here, you know, presumably this would have been shot at the same time as the funeral sequence at the beginning, with all these extras around outside the church. But the first half of that sequence was never filmed. But there's a disjunction between going to church, vicar's daughter, and the very dark thoughts that Deborah Kerr is expressing as she does so.
All the truth. How did Miss Jessel die?
Please, Miss, we'll be late.
How did she die?
In wickedness. She put an end to herself. She was found in the lake, drowned.
In the film, we learn that she committed suicide, drowned, hence the association with the lake. It may be an idea that was picked up from Benjamin Britten's opera The Turn of the Screw, because it's a detail that isn't in the Henry James story. It's important because it associates Miss Jessel with water, just as Quint is associated with the tower, which Edmund Wilson made much of in his Freudian interpretation. Tower equals man, lake equals woman. It's all pretty crude stuff, but then Freud had only recently been discovered by literary critics. And instead of being buried in unhallowed ground, which she might well have been, Miss Jessel is in fact buried in the churchyard with everyone else. And we see this posy of flowers which has been put down by Flora. A little bit like the posy of flowers that she chucked out of the carriage window just after they'd met Miles at the station. And even that is seen as sinister by Miss Giddens now. It could just be in memoriam Miss Jessel. Because remember, the uncle says at the very beginning, don't mention Miss Jessel to Flora because she meant so much to her. So it could be perfectly innocent, the innocence. But by now, Miss Giddens is interpreting everything as demonic possession. And now she decides, after the turning point of the discovery about Miss Jessel, that she must go to London, to Harley Street, to see the uncle. Up to now, she's desperately been trying to impress the uncle. not just being a governess, but a cause where she can show that she's in control and that his trust in her wasn't misplaced. And that's part of her over-anxiety throughout the film. But now she's decided to go and see him, and she goes up to the schoolroom. And this is a very, very important moment. It's the first moment in the film where you get a shot of one of the ghosts with Miss Giddens in the same shot. Up to now, you've had reaction followed by a picture of ghosts. Now you have them both in the same shot. They're getting more involved with her fantasies. Truman Capote said he reckoned this was the one mistake he made in the whole script. He kept to the convention that maybe the ghosts were a figment of her imagination and you see her reaction before you see the ghosts. But on this occasion, because there's a teardrop, there's something objective there, albeit something that's transient. This won't be evidence because teardrops disappear. But nevertheless, there's a physical reality to the ghosts. And he said, I really let the show down.
Miss Giddens?
In the script, it's an interesting ambiguity about it. On the desk lies an open exercise book showing Flora's round, childish writing. The ink is blurred in places, as though by tears. Miss Giddens touches one of them with her finger. It is still wet. They could be Flora's tears in the script, but in this, it is quite clear they are not Flora's tears, they're Miss Jessel's tears.
Anna's giving them their milk.
So Jack Clayton is saying, believe this is a ghost story, as well as believe the Freudian interpretation. And I think that gives strength and body to the film, rather than letting the show down.
She was waiting for me.
Ooh.
She spoke.
And look at Miss Giddens sitting exactly as Miss Jessel did, in black, with the cameo brooch, in the chair, at the school desk. She is turning in a strange way into Miss Jessel, just as Miles, in a strange way, is turning into Quint, with all sorts of permutations to that relationship. Permutations which, more than anything else, were to upset 20th Century Fox when they saw the film. So the executives at 20th Century Fox said, you cannot have a child behaving as if he's an adult in this way, and the whole dominance-dependence thing that emerges in the latter part of the film. But Jack Clayton stuck to his guns.
No. And share this hell.
Then surely you must tell the master.
I can't leave them now.
Stuffed birds in the background, another piece of Victoriana, which, rather like the clutter in the attic, adds to the mise-en-scène.
Without his help, I think...
And here, the governess begins to steel herself to the crusade, make them admit to this, make them confront it, bring this thing out into the open. She begins to become more authoritative. And Mrs. Gross begins to worry, but the governess now has the certainty of the daughter of a country vicar. When Freddie Francis was asked what's his favourite set of sequences in the film, and when Jim Clark, the editor, was asked, both said, it's this and the subsequent scene. Here she is, and Jack Clayton wrote on his script, this has got to be very powerful. You've got the Holy Bible, you've got the crackling log. She puts the Bible down, and, of course, the petal of a rose lands on it, the decay of beauty. Suddenly, you get these sounds. The piano playing in her head. And then voices. And this is the first time we've really had a sense of this being a subjective thing that's going on in the governess's head. Edmund Wilson wrote at the beginning of his famous essay, observe that there is never any evidence that anybody but the governess sees the ghosts. She believes that the children see them, but there is never any proof that they do. She's holding these candles, and they were 4 or 5 wick candles in order to give enough light. It's a classic example of the tunnel of light approach of Freddie Francis using the CinemaScope screen. They had the devil's own job matching up the candles. Actually, if you watch the candles in this sequence, they do, I'm afraid, change from slightly burnt down to new ones to slightly burnt down again, because it's incredibly difficult to get continuity. a mixture of candlelight, light in the middle, dimmer switches as she went from one part of the house to the other, created this very effective candle-lit scene.
Can't forget his eyes. They were open.
What shall I say when his feet enter softly, leaving the marks of his grave on my floor?
When Stanley Kubrick made Barry Lyndon, he shot the movie famously by candle power, which added squillions to the budget. Well, he could have used a dimmer switch and Freddie Francis and a few 4-wick candles, and you would have got just as good an effect. A classic sequence.
Kiss me, kiss me, kiss me, kiss me.
Jim Clark has said that he's slightly embarrassed by the sound editing here because the electronic sounds, the reverb and the echo and the slowing down that he used were state-of-the-art at the time, but today seem a little bit crude. And so you get this kind of Hammer Filmsy echo effect on the voices. I don't think it matters too much. It's of its time. The things she hears as she walks around the corridor are little snippets of dialogue that she's heard earlier in the film.
You're hurting me.
You're hurting me. That's the line that she said to Miles when she was up in the attic. But now it takes on a much more sadistic kind of Miss Jessel. You're hurting me. Look at that tunnel of light, black for 2/3 of the screen on both sides, with her in the middle, lit by Freddie Francis. It's an amazing use of CinemaScope. And there's a moment in the corridor where you think you see something out of the corner of her eye. And in fact, what it was when they were editing, the clapperboard was in shot for a couple of frames of film, and they decided, no, we won't cut that, we'll keep it in. Knock before you enter. Now, that's an interesting phrase. Did the children see what Quint and Miss Jessel were getting up to? Knock before you enter. Is it the children outside who are coming in and surprising Quint and Miss Jessel? The turn of the screw, round and round and round. In a way, it's a reference to the title of the story. In fact, at the beginning of the story by Henry James, he explains what he means by the turn of the screw. If one turn of the screw is a ghost story, you can take the audience even more with you, another turn of the screw, if it's a ghost story involving children. And so that's why he called it the turn of the screw. That moment where the camera zooms in on the sculpture on the wall, yet another sculpture like the military sculptures, the classical sculptures in the garden, that moment was said by critics to be a very Hammer film moment. Well, it is in a way. The Henry James buffs tended to say that it breached the cardinal rule that Henry James had written down with reference to one of his short stories. James wrote, "Only make the reader's general vision of evil intense enough, and his own experience, his own imagination, his own sympathy and horror will supply him with all the particulars. Make him think the evil, make him think it for himself, and you're released from weak specifications." Well, the buffs thought that sculpture and indeed some of the other Hammer film type effects were weak specifications, too specific, too obvious, and letting down the show. But Henry James also wrote about the turn of the screw that it is a piece of ingenuity, pure and simple, of cold artistic calculation, an amusette to catch those not easily caught, the jaded, the disillusioned, the fastidious. The story is a kind of trap to catch people who have a rather jaded palate. And if this film is one thing, it's a trap. It's full of clues going in different directions.
Miles, what were you doing? When? You were looking up at the tower. You saw something.
The complexity of the script and the filming, I think, matches what Henry James wanted his story to do, to trap people into all sorts of assumptions about what's going on before their very eyes. And Henry James was rather snobbish about what he called the vulgar horror story. He didn't want to be associated with that, in the same way that Jack Clayton didn't want to be associated with Hammer and the reputation that those films had for schlock. He wanted people who were not easily caught. And I think all these clues, this multivalent film, this very grown-up ghost story, was his way of catching people who weren't easily caught.
Well, I thought I might be becoming a bore.
Miles, tell me the truth.
But I am.
Most haunted house movies up to now had been burlesques, things to laugh at. Abbott and Costello, The Old Dark House, The Ghost Catchers, which is like Hell's a Poppin', and spooky stories of the haunted house of horror and that sort of thing. Yes, there'd been Psycho. Yes, there'd been Vertigo, if you treat that as a ghost story, which it is of sorts. But on the whole, it's Ghost Train time. So it's quite an effort to present a genre film, which is a ghost story for grown-up sensibilities, and that multivalence is something that people weren't used to, and there's no doubt the reviewers weren't quite sure at what level to take this film. And now she finds under the pillow the dead pigeon, the casual cruelty to animals that runs through this film, Rupert, the tortoise, being held underwater, the spider and the butterfly. And here we have the pigeon, who presumably has been shot with the catapult that she found earlier when she went into Miles's bedroom. Are these just the casual cruelties of young children? It's a very Victorian idea, this sentimentality about animals, like Landseer's paintings, where there's casual cruelty to animals all the time, depicted in his famous canvases. And then you get this astonishing moment where Miles leans forward and kisses Miss Giddens directly on the lips. This was the moment that made the 20th Century Fox executives so upset. He's turning into Quint. It's making the sexuality of the story very upfront indeed, in a way that Henry James would never have done.
Are you writing to your sister, Miss Giddens?
No, Miles, to your uncle.
I knew you would.
Dissolved from dead pigeon to child playing the piano in a scene that was taken more from Benjamin Britten's opera, The Turn of the Screw, than the Henry James short story. In Benjamin Britten, the child plays the piano, and the nursery rhymes, the children's nursery rhymes, Lavender's Blue Dilly Dilly and Tom Tom the Piper's Son, slowly turn into something rather more sinister.
Always singing.
Do you like it?
Of course, what he's playing is the traditional English folk tune of Willow Whaley, with which the film began, and which is now associated with Flora singing with the musical box, with Miss Jessel's theme tune.
Flora! Flora!
This is the only glimpse we have of Mrs. Gross's living quarters, rather different design and layout, Victorian clutter, ceramics, prints on the wall, than the rest of the house.
We saw Miss Jessel! You see, she's taken the boat.
All alone, that child?
And we cut from Mrs. Gross's room to a reflection in the lake. And the weather's changed. Bly, having been incredibly sunlit, a fairy tale castle, not a Gothic gloomy mansion at the beginning. Now it's thunder and rain. Rain on her face, creating, as it says in the script, creating teardrops like Miss Jessel's tears in the schoolroom, like Miles's tears when he talks about how his uncle is neglecting him. The tears appear on Miss Giddens' face. And there's Flora dancing in the folly to the music box with the willows behind her. And as Miss Giddens comes forward, it's just like a reenactment of Miss Jessel and Flora dancing together. So we've seen them dancing together in Miss Giddens' imagination, and here they are, Miss Giddens turning into Miss Jessel and Flora turning into her victim. The George Auric electronic sound which suggests that something's about to happen, and the limpid lake just beyond. And of course, we get again Miss Jessel standing in the reeds, the lady in black, Tennyson's forlorn lady, staring at them. Is Flora dancing for her? Is Flora rather like the charades game where we had Miles going to the French window to summon Quint? Is this Flora summoning Miss Jessel? Or is it just a child going to the folly to get away from the tension in the house? Because Miss Giddens is certainly tense, and she's beginning to show it. And is it purely innocent?
And when did you learn to row, Flora?
Clayton was once asked whether the children understood what this story was really about, and is it a good thing for two kids aged 11 and 12 to understand the darker themes of the innocence of the Turn of the Screw. And he said he never gave the children the complete script. He'd give them their lines either the night before or a couple of days before and direct them entirely by mimicry. He also cut down the lines of the children. One of the problems with William Archibald's play is the children talk too much. It depends on professional stage actors as children holding the thing together. He didn't want that.
Where is she? You know you can see her. Look, Flora, look. There. You know you can see her.
Another shot that ties Miss Giddens in with the ghost. This is the second time that's happened. It happened in the schoolroom and now it happens here. In the first half of the film, they're never tied in together. But here they are. They're part of the same universe.
You must.
She's dead and buried.
And here's Pamela Franklin acting hysterics very, very effectively.
You're wicked. I hate you. I hate you. I hate you.
And what she gets is, I hate you, I hate you, I hate you. It's got to that stage because she's become so obsessed with getting the children to confront the evil that's in the house that it's completely blighted her relationship with Flora. The question is, will it blight her relationship with Miles as well? And that's really the subject of the rest of the film. The shot as she stands there, deliberately making Miss Giddens look like Miss Jessel, the two ladies in black facing each other across the lake of Sheffield Park. And it's at this point in the Henry James story that we get one of the most disturbing passages in the entire story. Miss Giddens, or rather the governess as she was called, writes, I seemed to float not into clearness but into a darker obscure, and within a minute there had come to me out of my very pity the appalling alarm of their perhaps being innocent. It was for the instant confounding and bottomless, for if they were innocent, then what on earth was I? And what's so disturbing about that, it's partly a rare moment of self-knowledge from the governess. What on earth was I? If they're innocent, what does this whole story say about me? But it's also the appalling alarm of their perhaps being innocent. She's terrified at the thought they are innocent. She's so committed to the idea that she's fighting this cosmic crusade of protecting innocence from evil that it's appalling to her to imagine even for a moment that they're ordinary children who are innocent. And that, in a way, is the most frightening moment in the entire story. And in the script, these shrieks, these terrible shrieks of Flora, who's having a complete tantrum at this stage, it says that Flora's voice has a strange quality of stridency and depth about it. And it kind of sears through her head. And I think the camera, looking at her face, is really summing up what the Henry James story said at this point. She's thinking, my God, supposing I'm wrong, what have I done to these children? And that moment where she's caught in the light, I think visually captures that.
Now do you believe me? Now that you've seen?
Now that I've heard.
Jack Clayton of Freddie Francis said, we were very surprised that we had to use CinemaScope for this film and that Fox had made us use it. Actually, they can't have done. Freddie Francis had already shot in CinemaScope Sons and Lovers. Everyone knew that Fox was associated with CinemaScope. So it must have been known at a very early stage that this was a widescreen movie. And to me, it looks as though it was meticulously planned.
Well, you came.
You saw who taught her. You saw that woman.
I know what I saw.
We have Mrs. Gross saying, I know what I saw. And that line is added in handwriting to the script. It's such a wonderful line. We don't know quite what she means by it. I know what I saw. Don't tell me what's going on here. I know exactly what's going on. So when I go off to see the uncle with Flora, I know what I saw.
You were a complete innocent. Well, you lived here. You knew those two. You knew them when they were alive, and you knew what sort of influence they were on the children, and it frightened you. When I came here, you were still frightened. Oh, you were. I sensed it. And why? Because you felt they weren't really dead. And now, despite all that, you turn on me. You blame me. And all I want to do is save the children, not destroy them. Don't you know that?
All I know is Miss Flora was a sweet...
And there's Mrs. Gross coming out and actually saying, actually, I don't approve of what you're doing. I think you're responsible for a lot of this. I think you've created a lot of this situation, and it's now getting completely out of control.
Been the saving of her.
The whole relationship with Mrs. Gross has changed by now. The governess is standing on her dignity. The uncle has put her in sole charge. I'm the boss. You're the employee. The whole class relationship between the parson's daughter and the housekeeper, who used to be a maid and has been promoted, comes out in this.
We were together this afternoon, sitting in front of the fire. He didn't say anything, but he wanted to. It was like a pendulum, and I could feel it swinging my way, slowly, slowly. Oh, yes, he wanted to reveal himself and ask...
Miss Giddens is interpreting the silence now, just the look which Miles gave her, sitting by the fire, as evidence that he's trying to say why he was expelled. I mean, it's all about why a little boy was expelled from school and actually coming to terms with that. It's astonishing that this whole superstructure of the ghost story has been erected on that. And she thinks, just looking at him, that he was trying to say something to her to come clean. And if only he can confront it, if only he can say the words, then an exorcism will occur. Whether it's true or not, the terrifying final sequences will show us.
It is my decision.
It is my decision. Miss Giddens standing on her dignity at last, becoming the governess.
Miss Gross, tomorrow I must be alone here, with Miles.
Miss, may I ask what I am to tell their uncle? The truth.
As if it was that simple.
The truth. Yes, miss.
Wonderful. Yes, miss. What is Mrs. Gross thinking at that moment? She doesn't think there's ghosts. She hasn't seen Miss Jessel. She thinks Miss Giddens has overstepped the mark. What will you tell the uncle? The truth. Yes, miss. Rather a nice fantasy of what that scene might be like when Mrs. Gross and Flora arrive at Harley Street and tell the uncle what they really think has been going on in this house.
Uncle, I left it on the desk.
And there's a good moment here which epitomises what Deborah Kerr once said about her cinematic persona. She said, you know, there's a great emphasis these days on people who are neurotic. They seem to get all the sympathy. They seem to get all the airtime. What about people who are normal and conventional? Don't I deserve some sympathy? And in a way, it's her very normality and conventionality throughout these scenes as the governess that make her so sinister.
I suppose Miss Flora and I had best be on our way.
Give her my love when she's better. And Mrs. Gross, please, wait till you see Miles again.
It's rather sweet that Miss Giddens says, give her my love when she gets better. Because, as we'll see in the next scene, when Flora was like a doll, like an angelic little doll in the garden when she first met her, when she didn't seem like a real person at all, then Miss Giddens had great sympathy for her and reached out to her. But when she became a real person, with all the complexities that real people have, then Miss Giddens found it much more difficult to cope with her. I mean, this is someone who's never dealt with young children before in the role of a governess, and a lot of this could be put down to her lack of experience. So she's left alone in Bly House with Miles. Everyone else has gone in this vast neo-Gothic mansion with its neo-Gothic interior. It's 2 o'clock in the afternoon. She goes to the schoolroom in order to tidy up the books. There she is standing there where Miss Jessel was sitting and crying earlier. And she picks up a doll, which to her represents Flora. And like Miss Jessel earlier, she starts to cry. Miss Giddens is really crumbling by this stage. A mixture of insomnia, torment, really not knowing how to cope with the situation, seeing this huge cosmic battle going on around her is beginning to make her crack up. And that's the distinction between how she looks at the end of the film and how she looked at the beginning, which is that famous dissolve from the credit titles to the scene with the uncle. Maybe her hair's a little bit too much in place. Maybe she is a little bit overdressed by Motley. Maybe she's a bit bandboxy. She should look a lot iller than this by this stage in the story, certainly by the descriptions of Henry James in The Turn of the Screw. But never mind. The sound of the peacock in the garden again relates to so much else in the film. The sound of an animal in pain, which she hears on her first night, and Flora says, you get a lot of sounds, but Mrs. Gross says you should ignore them. The sound of the voice saying Flora as she arrived. Born on the wind, as the script puts it. These inexplicable sounds, which relates to the silence of Bly, punctuated by the sounds of nature, which have been so much an important part of the sound design of this film.
Where are the servants?
They've gone home.
Oh, did you send them? Or did they take fright and run away?
What do you mean?
Jack Clayton wrote to himself about this scene, "Don't be prissy with the dialogue of Miles. Miss Giddens is sure she can get to him. There shall still be a reluctant tenderness to this scene between the two."
But I do.
And here Miles is dressed in his bow tie and his jacket, with his hair spruced up, as if he's the man of the house, and she's become Miss Jessel. This dialogue could be Quint talking to Miss Jessel, "I'll protect you." But if it was Peter Wingard sitting there as Quint, the dialogue would be much the same. But it's actually being spoken by a 10-year-old boy.
More or less. There are still the others.
There are still the others, as she puts it. Maybe that's where the title of the subsequent film, The Others, came from. It's certainly a very pregnant phrase in a ghost story. But instead of the tentative Miss Giddens, who went into Miles's bedroom earlier in the film and didn't want to bring up the subject of why he was expelled from school, so she started sort of playing with things in the room in order to distract his attention, she's now absolutely on the offensive. She's an inquisitor, trying to find out from him why he was expelled from school and to name the name, Peter Quint.
As happy as I am.
Are you?
What?
So very happy. Are you, Miles?
If you'll excuse me.
Miles, you haven't...
It was Jack Clayton's idea that Bly House should have a conservatory, a steamy Kew Gardens of a place, where, as he put it, even the leaves sweat. And as he put it, this scene, the one we're about to see, should be very claustrophobic and played very close, developing into violence and savagery. It is bad and heavy, and both of them are frightened. And it takes place in this steamy environment of the conservatory, with steam on the windows, so you can't quite see the world outside.
Why were you in the garden?
I told you.
The real reason, Miles.
It's beyond...
Now, depending on how you interpret Miss Giddens' behaviour, she's almost completely deranged by this point. In fact, Miles says, "You are insane," because she's absolutely on the edge. She has to get a result. She has to get him to admit.
Makes you look ugly.
But look at it from the child's point of view. Imagine a governess behaving like this to you as you stand in the conservatory, and imagine you don't know what's going on around you. She was a very peculiar woman.
I'm not cruel. My father taught me to love people and help them even.
Important line. My father, the vicar, taught me to love people, taught me this language of fundamentalism, taught me to bring salvation to people whether they want it or not.
Against you, I don't...
All of that's programmed into her family background, and all of that's pouring out. She was brought up to save people, and she thinks she's saving Miles.
Because I'm different.
But you aren't. You're like any other boy.
Ah, now who isn't telling the truth? If you really thought that, we wouldn't be having these conversations.
The environment and the weather and all these things have actually been an outward and visible sign of the state of mind of Miss Giddens. Well, this is an example in the conservatory. It's hot and it's getting increasingly violent.
You, Miles, if you don't tell me now...
And she's almost becoming hysterical. As the script puts it, it's as though she's waiting for Quint to appear. She's desperate that she can have some objective evidence. And she begins to get out of... She thinks she's getting somewhere, as Miles admits why he was expelled from school. But actually, when you hear the words, it doesn't sound too guilty. He had evil thoughts, he used nasty words. Children do that. But to her, this is evidence that she's about to have a breakthrough.
Go on, Miles. What else did I say?
That's all I read. I heard footsteps.
And he admits to stealing the letter, which in Benjamin Britten's opera, The Turn of the Screw, is a key moment, because it actually shows that the ceremony of innocence is drowned, that it's objective evidence that these are dishonest children, and so there is much more to them than meets the eye. I don't think it quite has that meaning in this particular film. See the sweat on Martin Stevens' face, this clammy atmosphere of the conservatory for a very clammy conversation.
And sometimes, at night, when everything was dark, what? They screamed. The masters heard about it.
When I asked Deborah Kerr about her performance in this, which I still think is the finest performance of her career, she said she was absolutely studious about keeping the ambiguity of the character. She said to Jack Clayton, is Miss Giddens off her rocker, or are there ghosts in the house? And Clayton said, don't let the audience know. You've got to keep both. That there's enough in your interpretation that it could be simply the product of repression, but there's enough too in the film. The audience come away thinking they've seen a ghost story.
Shall I tell you who taught them to you?
I won't ever again, I promise.
Shall I tell you who taught you? The things you've done, the things you've said? Shall I tell you his name?
You don't fool me. I know why you keep on and on.
A fantastic moment as you see the face of Peter Wingard. Again, rather like the matte shot of Miss Jessel across the lake. It's in another dimension. You can scarcely see it with the breath on the window. This face of Peter Quint. It's a great example of what Stanislavski said about people who played small parts in films. There are no small parts, only small actors playing them. Well, Peter Wingard has this tiny part, but my God, you remember that face as it's at the window. And the two of them are together, the laughter of Quint, the laughter of Miles. In her mind, Quint and Miles are blending into the same person. And Quint is a kind of puppet master pulling the strings. When Miles says, "You damn dirty-minded hag," actually, in the script, as someone wrote, that's censor cover. What he originally said was, "You're a damn dirty-minded bitch," but they didn't actually dare put that into his mouth for the film, or they didn't dare show it to the censor.
There.
I didn't mean...
Oh, it wasn't you. That voice, those words, they weren't yours.
Forgive me.
Oh, Miles, dear Miles, say it now. Now, while I'm holding you. Say his name, and it will all be over.
Who?
What's extraordinary about this final climax is that the ambiguity still is sustained. She thinks she's winning and everything will be all right. And he says, who? He doesn't know what she's talking about. You are insane. She isn't winning after all.
Tell me his name. You must tell me his name.
He's dead!
Look!
No!
And here's an interesting moment. Camera goes around the sculptures. We see Quint standing where one of the sculptures was before.
He's dead! Here, you must say his name!
And then we get a very extraordinary shot, which is an overhead shot from Quint's point of view as he raises his hand. And the one shot which isn't her point of view of a ghost, there's an objective reality to this ghost standing on the pedestal. The one moment where that convention is broken, and the boy dies with the word "where" on his lips. Even at that stage, he may not know what she's talking about.
He's gone, Miles. You're safe.
In the original script, Deborah Kerr picks up the lifeless body of Miles and she carries him into the house at Bly as a flock of pigeons flies in a great white cloud and she walks into the dark doorway. But in the final version, it's like a Madonna and child, like that picture on the wall of mother and child, or is it possession, where, like the death of Quint, she lets out a scream, his eyes are open, and this scream of pain. There have been countless jokey ghost stories, and there have been some classic ones as well. Dead of Night, Vertigo, The Haunting, Don't Look Now, the others. But I honestly believe that if you take all the layers that I've been talking about in this commentary into account, that The Innocents is the greatest ghost story ever filmed, based on the greatest ghost story ever written. And this shot at the end matches exactly the shot with which the film began. Has this been a fantasy in Miss Giddens's head?